My name is Dr Werning. By profession, I am a political and social scientist. I took up literature and philosophy as well, but I took my PhD in political science. That's my main line of work. And I come from Germany. I live now at a place near the beautiful city of Cologne. So if the weather is very nice, I can see the dome of Cologne. But most of my life I spent actually outside Germany. So I'm a German by birth, but I don't really feel like a typical German. I'm more inclined to feel like a cosmopolitan. And my favorite fields of research is in fact Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, or formerly Burma, Cambodia. And in the past I have been doing extensive work on both Koreas as well. For a while I was responsible for the information campaign preceding the 24th Summer Olympics back in 1988. And I have visited Korea since 1970, more travels to the south, but also 3 times to the north. And due to the fact that I am very well acquainted with Koreans staying in Europe and having very good, close, intimate and long-time friends who happen to be Koreans, I get a fairly good update on what's going on. And in fact, there is one person, a very good friend of mine, who is very known in North Korea as well, especially among the academe. His name is Professor Song Do-yul. I mentioned it at yesterday's conference. A person who since 36 years now has been consistently barred to enter South Korea, because the South Korean government until now suspects that he has been very, very close to North Korea. Even they have been saying that he's even part of the North Korean nomenclatura, which is absolutely rubbish and crazy. And if ever he wants to go back, the authorities would like him to sign a letter of what they call repentance. Why should he repent? If someone who has been fighting consistently those nasty military dictators in South Korea we had over so many decades, I mean, that's really an outstanding achievement, and that is not something you should feel sorry about. In fact, last October we were both to attend a conference on reunification and peace on the Korean Peninsula in Seoul as well, and we were booked on the same flight. And before he from Berlin wanted to proceed to the airport in Frankfurt, he was given a signal from Seoul, boy, you won't be able to come also this time. So it's really ridiculous. It's very, very anachronistic. Many things in this part of the world are ridiculous, anachronistic, and to put it very politely, paradoxical. Well, I don't want to stretch things too far back into past history, more to focus on the, let's say, briefly on the last 100 years. You know, Korea is one of the very few places, if not the only place in the world, which was terribly victimized twice. First of all, they became a Japanese colony, and it was a brutal colonial rule the Japanese exercised over Korea from 1910 till 1945. Then the Koreans were very, very enthusiastic that after all, after 35 years of imperial and militarist and colonial Japanese rule, were about to chart their own destiny and find their own future. Well, instead of peace and the end of colonialism, what they were encountering was a massive military pacification. They fall into the trap of imperial designs of both superpowers then, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And it's only the US that is maintaining at least 37,000, if not more, 37,000 plus troops in Korea, in this case in the southern part, whereas Russian forces had left North Korea by the end of 40s already. You know, being a German by birth and knowing my own history, What Nazi Germany has done was an extremely brutal and nasty imperial rule and exerting power over other people in the West. In the East, it has been done, perpetrated by Japan. Germany was divided due to the fact that there were the aggressors starting World War II, at least in that part of the world. China was even victimized in the 30s. Korea before, as I said, was a colony by Japanese imperialism and militarism. So, how come Japan was not divided? Instead, Korea was punished as a victim of colonial rule. So if there should be any analogy, well, it's always very tricky to use analogies, but if there should be anyone, then it should have been Japan that should have been divided and not Korea. Korea had the, Korea was so unlucky as to be the place where the first hottest war ever during the Cold War era took place. And they were victimized by imperial designs. And that is the very, very, very deep tragedy. And given the fact that in those days, the then most sophisticated means of warfare, including biological and bacteriological warfare, you know, in America after 9/11 or 11/9, however you call it, there was a big fuss about the anthrax issue. How come no one is talking about the anthrax issue anymore? And this is really staggering. No one ever in the mainstream media ever hinted that these damn things were systematically used to wipe out Korean civilians during the 3-year lasting Korean War from June 1950 till the end of June of 1953. This is outrageous. So you get a sense also how victims are being treated. In this sense, I would like to recall something. If I'm not mistaken, in the US there's a talk show by Leslie Stahl. And several years ago, Madeleine Albright was invited to attend when she was still sitting in there in her capacity of being the ambassador to the US ambassador to the UN. And she was asked by the moderator, well, don't you think it's a very, very high price we pay, referring to the hundreds of thousands of kids that were starving and dying due to malnutrition in Iraq? That is even more staggering a number than Hiroshima. And then this lady leaned back and after all said, well, I think it's worth the price. I mean, you know, to draw a dividing and distinctive line between a murderer and a criminal and a diplomat at this very point of time is very hard to draw indeed. If someone openly says, well, it's worth to see more than 500,000 children dying of starvation and all the sanctions, I mean, to me that is really outrageous. I really question whether those persons ever have anything learned about morality, morals, and ethics. And this boils down to the question, how do we, seen from the Western perspective, deal victims or deal with victims? How do we analyze that? It seems a white victim is much more important and a much more precious life than any other victims. You see, and this has to do with some sort of historical continuity. What we found in Korea could later be found in Vietnam, in Rwanda, name all the places, name them all. You refer to the Korean War now. To the Korean War. Well, I mean, what we have to take carefully into consideration was the fact that basically the Japanese colonial army was defeated by different partisan groups or guerrilla groups being of Korean origin. Kim Il-sung then, who eventually became the leader of North Korea back in 1946 and has been succeeded since a couple of years ago by his son Kim Jong-il, was only one faction of those guerrilla forces who were fighting the Japanese. It was an important faction, but not the only one. So there were lots of different groups also operating in different parts of Korea, some even in Russia and Manchuria and so on. And after the liberation, they formed in all the big cities across Korea what they called people's committees. And it was after the landing of the American forces at Incheon, where all of us disembarked at the new airport. This was the main, and is still the main, port to service Seoul. So MacArthur's troops were actually landing at Incheon, and one of their first orders was to do away with all the people's committees. Meaning to say there was some sort of genuine democratic organizations and structures being put up where the Koreans were feeling very enthusiastic, and there was a sense of euphoria, as I said earlier, to chart their own destiny. But then this was really preempted, to use a tame term which is very common nowadays. This has been preempted by the military government, US military government, and especially under Douglas MacArthur. And then, of course, seen from the Korean perspective, this was a new interventionist force. The Russians kept a relatively low profile. Of course they were intervening in Korean affairs, in the sense that they were lending their support to the group eventually, which was led by Kim Il-sung. He was profiting from it. But Kim Il-sung was a very charismatic leader until the end of his life. He was really loved and cherished by the people, which you could not say at all by any South Korean president. And then imagine, the Americans flew in Lee Seung-man, or Seung-man Ri, but it's spelled Lee Seung-man. He was flown in from the US because he lived there in exile, and eventually he became the first president of South Korea, when both countries were formed. That was in August 15, 1948, eventually the Republic of Korea was founded, and a few weeks later, on September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, meaning to say North Korea, was founded, due to the fact that in the South the Americans were pressing so hard on the people's committees that they wanted to get their own way. Eventually, as I said earlier, the Russian troops got out of North Korea by the end of 40s. So by 48 at least, you had, due to imperial designs, the Soviet Union had also a role, there is no doubt about this historically, but more so and much more pronounced the American form of intervention. Because to me, at least, it's unheard of that there were Russian instigated massacres on a large scale. But it's a proven fact by now that there were massive massacres among the civilian South Korean population, instigated and tolerated by the US in connivance with the security forces of the South Korean political structure and paramilitary groups. And according to South Korean scholars, at least 1 million people died after World War II until the outbreak of the Korean War. There were big massacres at Jeju-do, or Jeju Island, at the southernmost island of South Korea. And things like this. So you can imagine that people must have felt very, very frustrated, to say the least, or again, victimized all over again. And if we think of the horrendous figures of how many people died, those were 4 million civilians. If you count all the military forces, more than 50,000 American soldiers also died. Then the North Korean soldiers, the South Korean soldiers, then the so-called volunteer forces the then People's Republic of China had sent, which became independent only back in October 1949. So all in all, a sum total, I mean, it's really staggering to think of more than between 5 and 6 million people who had died only a couple of years after World War II. And the scene of all this was Korea. And Pyongyang, for example, the capital of the Democratic Republic of Korea or North Korea, was flattened. When you go to Pyongyang, everyone will tell you, and from the photos, old photos you can see, they say that 2 or 3 bigger buildings were still intact. And so seen from the North Korean perspective, they were perceiving of the US forces being a perennial threat after World War II until now. And they were, since the foundation of the country, and since this was the center of the hot war during the Cold War era, there was a very, very pronounced sense of enmity, especially between North Korea and the US, and something which was also used by the US side, and especially the South Korean political parties and the South Korean side, to nourish this kind of culture of enmity. It was really crazy until recently. You could take a Seoul subway and you could see marks in the subway depicting a wolf and a white goose, things like that, and then the line was saying, if you sense there is a North Korean spy or someone spying for North Korea in the midst of your community, here is the telephone number, and give us a call immediately after you have spotted such people. It's ridiculous. I have seen here universities some years back where only people who were supposed to belong to the qualified academe, qualified means that they were very close to the state machinery, could read Marxist-Leninist literature behind glass walls, so that they could be seen from all sides, that they could not copy it or tear apart the book and take out some things. I mean, absolutely anachronistic. And even anachronistic until now. The aftermath of the Korean War is that since the beginning, or since the formation of the Republic of Korea in 1948, it is still intact, the so-called national security law. It has been modified many, many times, I think well over 50 times. But still, it's intact. And it punishes all those who keep up contact with North Korea or who even visit North Korea illegally. Back in 1989, I joined an international peace and reunification march from North Korea to the demilitarized zone. And there was a student leader, a woman, a girl, whose name is Im Suk-kyung. She came illegally from Berlin, Germany, to North Korea. And she was really treated like an ET on the one hand, like an extraterrestrial. And I have seen many, many old folks whose only desire was to grab the hand of this poor little student whose arms were bandaged already all over because of all her public appearances, and to see someone coming from the south, to see their own countrymen, that they are not having horns, that they are not devils, but made out of flesh and blood like any other human being. I mean, this was really something, and some sort of experience. And at Kaesong Station, Kaesong is the most southern city, most southernly located city in North Korea, near the demilitarized zone, another term which I will explain later. We were marching towards the railway station, and then I really had the feeling, Rainer, this is your end. Because from both sides we felt as if we are being pushed, pressured, and being suffocated, because the masses were trying to get closer to that woman with whom we were marching in the middle of the road, and then the security forces, the North Korean security forces, were hardly in a position to get control of the moment. And before things were about to turn from bad to worst, they were beating up, really, it were ugly scenes, beating up very hard even elderly people who fell down on the streets with blood streaming all over, and then eventually they stood up again and tried to grab the hand of this girl. Meaning to say, there is a very, very deeply pronounced sense of togetherness. And it is so tragic that without their doing, actually, it has led to this silly situation that by the end of next month, to be precise, on July 27, we mark the 50th anniversary of the end of the Korean War. What is the result of it? First of all, this, as many people do not know, this was an armistice that was signed. There is no regulated peace and order situation on the Korean Peninsula since then. People wanted to transform this armistice eventually into a peace agreement, but there is none. This is anachronistic and paradoxical. 50 years after World War II, more than a decade after the so-called end of the Cold War era, if someone wants to take a trip to study the Cold War, he is most welcome to go where we were 2 days ago in Dorasan or at Panmunjom to the so-called demilitarized zone. The demilitarized zone is the biggest euphemism you can think of. More than 1 million soldiers on both sides are facing each other, heavily armed. Then you have a wall, in parentheses, or a zone, a military zone, stretching more than 240 kilometers from east to west, dividing the Korean Peninsula roughly along the 38th parallel. And then it's 4 kilometers wide, so not even birds can find any nests there or pick any food. It's really ridiculous, and no exchange of communication of families. In Germany, at least, there were some sort of exchanges. It was regulated, but here it's almost non-existent. Or we are about to experience the 7th reunion of 100 families from both sides, North and South Korea, in a couple of days, after how many years? And to think about all this, I mean, this is really sickening. And during the last 5 decades, there were many times where it seemed that the Korean Peninsula is on the brink of another war. Now, we come back to the more modern times. Now, all of a sudden, in particular, after January 01, when Mr. Bush Jr., unfortunately in my viewpoint, became 43rd President of the United States of America, things got really and turned really sour. It is not the first time that North Korea is labeled a rogue state, certainly not. By the way, the North Koreans are reciprocating in their own way, calling the American nation a nation of cannibals. I mean, both sides are trying very hard to outdo the other, but as long as it is confined to words, or even silly, idiotic, psychopathic propaganda, that's a different story altogether. But what we experience now seems to be very much different from the situation of the last years. Let me go back 1994, which is only 9 years ago. Almost at the same time, on July 10, 1994, Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader, died. It was a time which was very precarious, because in those days the Clinton government massively attacked North Korea to be a rogue state. And I still remember times when there were lots of alarms being held in, across South Korea in bigger cities, where people had to go out in camouflage. CNN was drumming up this picture, well, North Korea is a menace and a threat in a Northeast Asian region, and they are about to invade Seoul. in one noble quarter of Seoul, I saw it with my own eyes in Gangnam, for example, people went to supermarkets to hoard cup noodles. And it was eventually Jimmy Carter who signaled that he will have a deal with Kim Il-sung. He visited North Korea, and both heads of state were supposed then eventually to meet each other to defuse the whole situation. So the menace was all there, the threat was there, it was propagandistically drummed up, and then all of a sudden it died out. The problem with the mainstream media is that they lack many things. First of all, soberness, then investigative approach, and worst of all, especially in times of globalization, with all the velocity and so on, they are suffering, well, in the positive way from partial, in a negative way from complete and total amnesia. I mentioned the case with untracked. How come, if it would have been really a big story and if it would have been done by outsiders, wow, believe me, it would be a hot story until today. But probably there's completely different things behind it. So in the case in North Korea, then everything was just diffused like that. And then this was in July 1994. Eventually, by October 1994, an agreement was being reached by the North Korean side and the US side. This was called the TheAgreed Framework. To put it in a nutshell, the outcome of this agreement was, or the immediate result was, among others, that the American side insisted that North Korea stops its nuclear program, which North Korea agreed to. In return, the Americans were to deliver annually 500,000 tons of oil to North Korea. Another thing was that in both respective capitals, meaning to say in Washington, D.C. as well as in Pyongyang, liaison offices are to be established and to eventually iron out all difficulties and establish diplomatic relations. Well, that looked good. That looked good. And there were lots of American scholars, really foremost scholars. I think of, for example, a real Korean expert certainly is Professor Bruce Cummings at the University of Chicago, and others, and even sober-minded politicians who really saw this to be a chance to really come into talking terms. I mentioned during my talk yesterday William J. Perry, who was a former Minister of Defense. He was commissioned then, in the aftermath of the TheAgreed Framework, by Bill Clinton, who was initially calling North Korea a rogue state, as a special emissary for North Korean affairs, to come out with a new formula how to deal with North Korea. And this is a very, at least the declassified version of this William J. Perry report, carries 11 pages, came out in October, I think October 21st, 1999, so not even 4 years ago. And this report, in a nutshell, was saying, first of all, the US government should be very much supportive of the then sunshine policy of Kim Dae-jung, who was only recently preceded by No Moo-yeon only end of February in 2003. The second was that with North Korea, a deal could be made, and to see to it that not only will they stop their nuclear program, but even banning missile tests, which North Korea then unilaterally proclaimed and sticked to, at least for a while. And very important, which is overseen many, many times, and I think there is systematically being done, because there was a special protocol to the TheAgreed Framework, which was very important for the North Korean side. And this special protocol said that the US side then guaranteed the national sovereignty of North Korea. Now, let's go back and at the very end of the Clinton era. Perry came out with his report 1999, more or less laying the groundwork of the then Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Madeleine Albright, again, and she visited by the end of October 2000, so only 2.5 years ago, Pyongyang. It was the highest ever, or the highest ever visit of American representative. And actually, after she left by the end of October 2000, Pyongyang, the red carpets were about to be rolled out for Mr. Clinton's last state visit abroad, eventually leading him to Pyongyang. Since he maintained, he and his administration were bogged down by the Intifada in the Near East, that he wanted to act as some sort of peace broker between the Israeli and Palestinian side. That's why this trip to Pyongyang eventually did not materialize. Then the whole thing changed, and really for the worst. Then Bush Jr. came to power, and it was only a couple of weeks later, in early March 2001, that the first Asian head of state who then visited Washington, D.C. and was invited at the White House was Mr. Kim Jae-jong, the president of South Korea. And he wanted to find support for his sunshine policy. Everything looked really promising. And then Mr. Bush, without beating about the bush, told the state guest straight, "Your sunshine policy is naive, and we shall cut all contacts with North Korea and only eventually resume bilateral talks after we have mapped out a new strategy towards the region, the Pacific region, East Asia and Southeast Asia." So everything was then really messed up, to say the least. And I cannot recall any incidents where a head of state and a guest was treated in a way that he really looked like a wet poodle. And for any East or Southeast Asian, to say the least, face saving is something that is really of utmost importance. Nah? Koreans would say, "Chaemyeon," it has to do with personal dignity and putting up your face and personal worth. And if this is being preempted in such a shameful way, and calling him a naive zealot or someone who after so many years took steps at least to de-escalate things on the Korean peninsula, I mean, that was outrageous enough. And now, if we look back now all of a sudden, the war drums are being beaten like hell, and North Korea had the privilege to be included since January 2002 into this silly axis of evil. I mean, axis of evil can only be propagated by people who think that they are incorporating and embodying the good. And whether they do, that is something that needs to be measured and that needs to be qualified by others and not themselves. And if we look back now to the recent developments, Iraq, Iran and North Korea are part of the axis of evil. So the first that was taken on was Iraq. And to me it's just outrageous and beyond any logic and really a silly remark ever by this gang Minister of War and his assistant Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, saying, well, probably the broadest possible denominator was to talk about weapons of mass destruction in order to get people to accept our side. I mean, till now they can be searching and searching. Ironically, they are always taking on a very, very weak enemy lately. So that is really surprising. America saying that this is the biggest and mightiest nation on the world. My goodness, look at Afghanistan. What are you going to do in Afghanistan? You created more problem than had been ever solved. The same will happen in Iraq. And then later they were shifting this flimsy excuse. Eventually it was regime change. Now, last week only, after Pentecost, probably the Holy Spirit must have inspired Mr. Paul Bremer in Iraq, the chief administrator now. After this, Mr. Garner was an utter failure and left the scene. Now, Paul Bremer tells us the Iraqi National Congress, which has been put up by the American government to be the eventual alternative to form a civilian government in Iraq, he literally said they are disorganized amateurs. Disorganized amateurs, which was very polite by him, to say the least, because Ahmad Chalabi, the head they were pinning so many hopes on, he's a criminal. He's wholeheartedly invited to go to Amman. The Jordanian authorities will be very, very happy to give him what they think he deserves, a 21-year sentence. Well, if you deal with such criminals, it's like leaving out the bottle imp. It's very easy to do that, or you can leave out the toothpaste of the tube, but to pull it back, that is very impossible. So it's very funny and frightening sometimes that so many evil creatures were formed on behalf or with the intent or with active support of former American governments, used as a pawn when they were useful, and then labeled bandits, criminals, when they were obviously running counter to their own interests. If we talk of regime change, my goodness, the Indonesians would have loved to have a regime change instead of bearing 32 years the Suharto dictatorship, which was actively supported by then American governments, and even in times of amnesia, no one talks about it, a couple of hours before Indonesian forces invaded East Timor in early December 1975, it was Mr. Gerald Ford, the then President of the United States, and his foreign minister, Mr. Henry Alfred Kissinger, who were in Jakarta, who were informed by Suharto that he is going to invade East Timor, where eventually 200,000 out of 800,000 people died, according to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, due to the aftermath of the Indonesian invasion. Mr. Kissinger, what John Lewis, I think, once in Washington Post called Kissinger realism, only insisted then in his talks to Suharto, Mr. President, only start your invasion, please, after my president and I have landed in Washington, D.C. And it exactly followed that script. And Kissinger is even recorded to have advised Suharto, see to it that this invasion takes place in form of a quick fix. Don't make a big fuss out of it. Go into like a surgical strike and see to it that you annex it. And they did. It was eventually annexed with the 27th province of Indonesia until it became independent only 1 year ago. So if we take at face value what politicians, especially under the Bush administration, tell us, they have been very imprecise, to be polite, or outright liars. Why should we believe into them now when they drum up and are drumming their war threats against North Korea? Even if North Korea would have nuclear arms, the problem still is the delivery system. And even to so what? The South Korean president, Kim Dae-jung, literally said, the North Korean arms look like toys compared to the military arsenal of the US. North Korea has never been a threat to anyone, neither to China, nor to Japan, nor to any other neighboring country. And the Korean War, from their perception, was, well, you cannot invade your own country. Huh? So, to me, it seems that after Iraq, people want to capitalize on this momentum and to see to it that the other two countries left, Iran and North Korea, could eventually be dealt with in the way what happened in Iraq. Because once you lose the momentum, you will lose potential support. And people are very much alert in the US as well as in Europe or in this part of the world, and they're very much concerned about very existential issues of peace and war. So I find this time to be a really decisive moment, and it's very amazing to me. Before, years ago, many people were very critical in South Korea towards the North. They didn't like them. But it was mentioned yesterday, and there were even some polls taken since autumn last year in South Korea, and they were really incredible in the sense that the majority, the lion's share of youth, students, pupils and so on, were thinking of North Koreans to be their closest friends they could think of. They were given a chance. If you would like to live with someone indoors or to have your neighbors, it were the North Koreans, which really changed. I mean, that's a dramatic change over years back. So the image, the faux image, has really gone. And it is now the US that drums up this image of foes, enemies, adversaries, running directly counter to what both people in North as well as in South Korea are feeling. And ironically, the new president won because he had the support of the youth. They were very keen to see to it that the Sunshine Policy is followed up and that even the relationship is getting closer than it has ever before. And in this particular situation, a foreign power comes in and wants to thwart those efforts and preempt all those diplomatic and political initiatives. This is really a criminal act. And I think that Mr. No Mu-yeon, the South Korean president, he only assumed office end of February. Hardly 4 months have passed, and he has lost much of his credibility because literally he has been coerced to follow the line of the US together with Japan. In Japan, it was only on June 6 that even in the upper house, the so-called war or emergency laws have been passed. I mean, this gives a potential clout to the military or the so-called self-defense forces in Japan as well. Now, so, whereas objectively, times could have been hardly better for inner Korean rapprochement, this is being also politically and diplomatically preempted by the current US administration. This is one thing. But it could, of course, escalate the whole thing. And the worst scenario ever, which I hope will never take place, it would be really disastrous, would be if they would employ so-called mini nukes to bomb the whole Yongbyon complex. So my hope still is that the Chinese side will do their utmost to trying to de-escalate the whole situation. So it's really, as I said, absolutely paradoxical. 50 years after the war, more than 10 years after the Cold War era, it seems we are entering a different phase of a new Cold War era. Hopefully only cold and not hot again.